During the Meiji era, the government began implementing a policy of expelling anomalies and demons on a large scale, an effort referred to by the people as the purging of monsters. The man hailed as the Demon Slayer worked for a circus. Although called a circus, it resembled more of an arena for entertaining the masses outside. The circus leader inadvertently purchased a goblin that had been captured, using it as a spectacle for performance. In this circus, there were hardly any humans. It was filled mostly with spirits and monsters. The next morning, as he wandered the streets, he was followed by a group of children. He scared them off, making them run away in fear. Afterward, he bought a beer and saw some locals beating a cat, thinking it was a demon. Since the demon slayer was present, they asked him to deal with it. However, he believed it was just a cat, so instead of harming it, he merely shooed it away. The locals enjoyed watching him fight monsters but didn't care for interacting with him in everyday life. That evening, he returned to the arena, and coincidentally, the cat turned out to be a real demon. After the show, he left the arena and realized he was being followed. The girl who was tracking him ran outside when she didn't find him in his room and was caught by him. He wanted to know what was inside a certain cage, so he approached, prompting her to retaliate. She pulled out a gun, but he quickly disarmed her and pinned the gun to the ground. He soon subdued her, and a voice from the cage pleaded for him to spare this servant girl. She then put away her gun and picked up the cage again. The voice inside knew who he really was. He was a half-demon, experimented on and implanted with numerous demons in his body, struggling to remain sane. Using his demonic power daily would eventually lead to his being consumed by the demon within. The voice proposed a deal. The curtain was then lifted to reveal the head of a girl named Aya, who was immortal. She challenged him to kill her, offering in exchange a way to extend his life. She had lived for over 900 years, and demons were the only creatures that could nullify her immortality. But the one who inflicted such misfortune on her was a half-demon, so his strength was only half, and he could not completely kill her. It was known that a year ago, she was attacked by a half-demon who took her body. She did not see his face but only knew the name of his master. He was an old foreigner with a hoarse voice, walking with a cane. She wanted to find him but really had no clues, so she approached Shinichi, who is also a half-demon, but with a larger demonic portion than human. Therefore, she was not confident that he could kill her. Shinichi then suggested moving elsewhere to discuss things, as staying there might draw the circus owner's attention, leading to them being pulled back to perform, which was exhausting. He then introduced himself by his full name for easier communication. His name was Shinichi. Aya then wondered why he craved life, continuing to perform despite knowing that he would soon be consumed by the demon. He admitted that he was aware of this, but performing and becoming a demon was part of his intention. If he lost his sanity and transformed, it would be during a performance. The very audience who saw him as mere entertainment would be the first victims, and he wanted to see how many he could kill before being stopped. He considered this the most enjoyable way to die and a way to reform society. However, when she mentioned there was a way to extend his life, he abandoned that idea. But he told her straightforwardly that he would not kill her. It wasn't that she truly wanted to die. Living with just a head was simply boring. However, he was willing to help her retrieve her body. The old man who had stolen her body was the same one who had caused his current plight. The cane of the old man had an M engraved on it, and Aya confirmed this was correct. So, the deal changed. Aya knew her body was in Europe, meaning they would face a long journey to retrieve it. Shinichi then asked Aya what the method was for extending his life, to which she replied that he only needed to consume a part of her body. But, of course, nothing from her head was allowed. She realized that secretions from her body also had effects, so he could choose between her sweat and saliva. He chose the latter, and Aya asked him to bring his face forward. The two sealed their cooperation with a kiss, treating it as a contract. Meanwhile, in France, a father and son vampire duo were out hunting deer. The father wanted to use a gun, but unable to keep up with the deer's speed, he resorted to catching it with his hands. When the son asked why he carried a gun if it was of no use, he explained that it was a gift from the mayor, so he felt obliged to try it. Vampires had started mingling with humans since the demise of Count Dracula. Coexisting with humans seemed safer than confronting them. Upon returning home, the son asked why they kept silverware hidden, and the father believed it was to prevent other hunters from using it against them. Entering the storage, the father found a silver bullet stained with vampire blood, which sent him frantically searching for family members. He found his eldest son and the butler, but when he asked about his wife and youngest daughter, he learned his wife was in her room and his youngest daughter was singing with the maid. No signs of an intruder were evident. When he entered his wife's room, he was heartbroken to find her dead from a gunshot wound. Days later, the press started flocking to his home. He was Count Goddard. Having lived 20 years without consuming human blood, he had the rights of a citizen, but he still faced prejudice and extremism. Surrounded by the press, he refused to speak to them, but a young journalist named Annie asked what he intended to do about the case. He decided to hire detectives, as he found the police too careless. Hearing about the detectives he was hiring, Annie suspected he had enlisted the duo Aya and Shinichi for the investigation, which he confirmed. The pair were currently en route to meet Count Goddard by horse-drawn carriage. According to him, they had solved several monster-related cases previously. Though their identities and the truth about them were still somewhat murky, they were at least more trustworthy than the police. Upon arrival, Shinichi haggled with the coachman. He argued about the bumpy ride, demanding a reduction in fare. Aya urged him not to bully the poor man further. Nevertheless, Shinichi stubbornly negotiated a small discount, to which the coachman reluctantly agreed. However, Shinichi had no money, so he told the coachman to collect the fare from Count Goddard. The coachman later went to complain to the Count about being bullied by Shinichi. The Count instructed the butler to fetch the money to pay him. Shinichi introduced himself to the Count, and when he heard Aya's voice, he mistook her for the maid Shizuku. But Aya asked Shizuku to store their luggage, which confused the Count even further as he could not figure out where Aya's voice was coming from. It wasn't until Shinichi finally revealed that Aya was only a head that the Count and his sons understood her condition and that she could still function healthily. Since she was only a head, her primary tool was her brain. She asked Count Goddard to recount the entire scene. He took them to his wife's room to examine the scene. Since vampire bodies decompose quickly, his wife had already been buried, but photographs remained. The photos showed that his wife had been stabbed in the heart with a sharp stake. There were no signs of struggle on her face, suggesting she was asleep when attacked, meaning the perpetrator struck directly into her heart. The back of the chair wasn't scratched, and the fact that the murderer evaded the vampire's keen senses indicated they were highly experienced. There were no external wounds, suggesting the murderer might have used holy water to conceal additional traces at the scene. The holy water bottle was still there, with blood on the bottle's mouth. Another issue was the silver stake found in the storage, a place only the Count and the butler had keys to. If a vampire touched silver, even if it was cloth-wrapped, it would cause unbearable burning and not heal. From this, Aya deduced 7 points. First, the murderer must be a relative to bypass the lady's senses. Second, why did the murderer strike at night when vampires are weakest during the day? Third, the lock to the storage was found broken. And why was the holy water bottle left there? Fourth, why did the murderer know about the silver stake in the storage and precisely where and when the lady slept? Fifth, why was the silver stake returned to the storage? At this point, Count Goddard was becoming overwhelmed. Suddenly, his youngest daughter came by and Shinichi scared her off. Aya mentioned that she would discuss points 6 and 7 later. She then joined the Count's family for dinner. The coachman was also invited to dine, but he seemed somewhat uneasy. He was also quite surprised to see that Aya was just ahead. The Count's family drank blood to maintain their strength. While the guests had normal food, Aya did not need to eat. The Count's family was skeptical about the capabilities of the two detectives and even thought they might be frauds and unreliable. Although the Count found them odd, he noticed they were astute in their investigation. Aya decided to demonstrate a little of her skills. This was when the coachman asked how she knew he was having trouble with his wife. He was an alcoholic, but his wife had banned him from drinking for a long time. First, she pointed out stains on his shirt that faded due to frequent spills. indicating he often spilled food, a sign of drunkenness. Secondly, his beard was unkempt, but his shirt was neatly buttoned, and a button had been recently sewn on. He also seemed to have not drunk alcohol for a week because his shirt hadn't been washed. His wife was evidently tired of dealing with a drunken husband, so he had stopped drinking to maintain peace at home. Realizing he needed to appreciate his considerate wife more, he decided to quit drinking. The Count's eldest son was impressed and even compared her to Sherlock Holmes. Aya then returned to discussing the case. The body was discovered at 1:30 a.m. The family had a routine of having dinner at midnight. At 12:30 a.m., his wife finished her meal and went to her room to rest, while he met his eldest son in the study to discuss town affairs. The youngest daughter was also there. Afterwards, he went hunting. When he went to the storage to get his gear, nothing was amiss. As he left, his second son asked to come along, and they were in the woods together until their return. He fired 3 shots at a deer but missed. His eldest son also heard these 3 shots. After the father went hunting, the eldest son returned to his room to read, leaving his sister in the care of the maid. Aya questioned the second son about what he did in the time between the end of dinner and when they went hunting. He became defensive, arguing that if he hadn't committed a crime, there was no reason for him to be startled. The second son was most suspicious because he was alone in his room from 12:30 to 1 a.m. and heard no noises. Aya then questioned the maid about her whereabouts from 12:30 to 1:30 a.m. She was cleaning up and then saw the young lady bothering her brother, so she played with the young lady until 1:30 a.m. She did take a bathroom break for about 1 or 2 minutes in between. The youngest daughter confirmed this as well. The butler, on the other hand, was busy working and arranging the Count's schedule and was alone during that time. After hearing the explanations, Aya felt that the eldest son and the butler had no alibis. She suspected someone from within the house because, as she had explained earlier, it was difficult to believe an outsider could be the perpetrator. The youngest daughter ran off, causing the maid to chase after her. They finished the meal, and Aya asked Shizuku to keep an eye on the 2 servants in the house, as it was unlikely the eldest son was the culprit. He also came forward and threatened both about not being the one who harmed their mother. Aya knew he wasn't the perpetrator because she had observed everyone's hands during the meal, and all 3 vampires showed no injuries, indicating they hadn't wielded the stake. For now, someone needed to find that stake. Meanwhile, Shizuku was monitoring the 2 household staff. At 1 a.m., when the butler wanted to get back to work, Shizuku stopped him. The maid revealed that the Count and Shinichi had gone into the woods, which made the butler nervous and anxious. Meanwhile, as the Count walked, he spoke of hearing about a creature believed to be immortal and had lived for over 1,000 years. But Aya mentioned that even immortal beings have weaknesses. Demons can kill immortals, but are very poor at defending themselves. A single bullet is enough to kill them. Humans had nearly eradicated all demons, and very few remained now. The Count realized that both were talking about themselves, a demon and an immortal. Both knew their secrets were exposed, so they no longer hid them. Suddenly, Count Goddard was attacked from behind, so he turned off the lights and rushed to apprehend the assailant. He quickly captured the hunter and believed he had killed his wife. However, Aya pleaded for him to spare this man. The man's sleeve was stained with coal dust, indicating he had been on a long train ride. He claimed he was here to avenge a hunter whom the Count had killed, but that person had attacked him first, so he was merely defending himself. He then recounted that the hunter had planned to kill the Count and was confident because he had help. The hunter had carried a stake, and he didn't know it was made of silver. Aya convinced the Count to let this man go since he had learned his lesson. She revealed that thanks to this hunter, she no longer needed to wander the forest. She wanted the Count to gather everyone so she could solve the case. Upon returning, Aya declared that the culprit was among those present. The eldest son was skeptical, but the Count wanted to hear her out first. She revisited the 7 suspicions. First, the culprit was familiar enough to deceive the lady. Second, the culprit struck at night instead of during the day. Third, the culprit left the bottle at the scene. Fourth, the culprit was well aware of the schedule within the castle. Fifth, the culprit intentionally left the silver stake in the storage. The 6th suspicion concerned the sound. At the time the lady was murdered, both the eldest son and the butler were near her room yet heard nothing, which was peculiar. Both had no alibi but also seemed unlikely to be accomplices. She suspected the crime occurred before 1 a.m. The culprit likely used something to muffle the sound of the stake being driven in. But since only her dress was found at the scene, the culprit might have used just wrist strength to execute the act. Why didn't the culprit use a hammer to drive in the stake, given that hearing a hammer wouldn't be unusual? Because the lady often repaired furniture, the culprit might have feared a hammer would damage the stake. This led to the conclusion that the murder weapon was not made of silver. The silver stake found in the storage might have been blood-stained to mislead. But what material could cause the lady's death, yet easily break if struck with a hammer? Let's set that aside because Aya wants to raise the seventh suspicion. The bottle found in the lady's room wasn't actually used for holy water. It was dusty, and cleaning only the outside didn't make it clean inside. If it contained water, how could it get dirty? So, it seems the bottle was never filled with water, but was just placed at the scene to deceive. However, the lady's wounds showed signs of damage from holy water. This leads to the conclusion that the real culprit froze the holy water into a stake to commit the crime. The culprit used a coat at the scene to cover the blood splatter. The ice stake quickly melted, causing the wounds on the lady's skin. The culprit then took the lady's blood and, while the count was hunting, went to the storage to set up the fake crime scene. The aim was to make the count misunderstand the time of the crime as after 1 a.m., not before. Therefore, the person without an alibi from 12:30 to 1 a.m. would be the culprit. The two fitting this time frame are the maid and the second son. But the person would need to be strong enough to drive the stake and have a brief period to create the fake scene. The second son is the most suspected. He claimed he was a vampire and couldn't handle silver or holy water. That's true. But if the culprit had cut off his own hand and healed it, that's different. From this, it can be confirmed that the second son is the culprit. He immediately panicked and charged at Aya, but was caught by Shinichi and thrown outside. According to Aya, the reason the second son is the culprit is that he opposes and despises humans. But the count chose to befriend humans, so he created this crime to make his father see the truth. He was in contact with the hunter and created an opportunity for the hunter to attack the count and steal the iron stake and the bag. Since the count's family often went to church, he could easily take holy water and bring it back, placing it in the hunter's bag and leaving it in the woods overnight to freeze. And the rest is as we have seen. At this point, the second son was attempting to attack Shinichi, but there was no way Shinichi would let a mere kid defeat him. He gave the second son a memorable thrashing while simultaneously recounting his own backstory to him. After wrapping things up, he returned to Aya. She and Shinichi were preparing to leave. As dawn was breaking, the young journalist Annie arrived. She was familiar with Shinichi's group from before and knew about Aya being just ahead. Shinichi suggested that if she wanted to ask about the case, she should speak to the butler. Meanwhile, Shizuku and Shinichi were chasing each other around, and Aya checked if the count was all right. He had lost a wife and now a son, but he still had to reveal the truth to the world. Aya asked him about the man with the cane marked with an M, whom he had met not long ago and who had invited him to London, but he had declined. With a clue in hand, Shinichi and Aya continued on their journey. Meanwhile, on a train, two new characters appeared. The white-haired one was known as the Ghost of the Opera, and the blonde-haired one had a request for the ghost to fulfill: to steal a diamond from a museum in London, where Detective Sherlock Holmes was active. The ghost accepted the job, and at that time, Shinichi and Aya also arrived in London. According to the British press, the person who hired the Ghost of the Opera was the infamous thief Lupin. Journalist Annie had also followed them to London. Shinichi's group was on their way to a cane shop to request a customer list. As they left and entered an alley, they encountered two men who demanded the customer list Shinichi was carrying. Suddenly, they were caught by the police and taken to a van. On the van, a pair of twins were also arrested. Aya and another man noticed that these two were thieves because their wrists were red from carrying heavy objects. Their fingernails had sawdust, indicating the heavy items were ceramic. This deduction was confirmed when one of them inadvertently admitted it. The news reported that a famous figure known as the Iron Man was hiring detectives to investigate a thief named Lupin targeting his treasures. Coincidentally, the two detectives he hired were Aya and Sherlock Holmes, and Sherlock Holmes was actually the person accompanying them on this van. The police realized this and turned the vehicle towards the mansion of the Iron Man. At the mansion, it was known that the Iron Man and his butler had set a record for circumnavigating the world in 80 days. At this moment, Annie, who was outside the gates of the mansion, was thrilled to see the two famous detectives. Meanwhile, the ghost of the opera also heard this news. When they met the Iron Man, he was not overly surprised to see Aya, as he had already heard of her from the immortal. Aya thought she only investigated monsters, so she didn't think this case would be much help. However, to him, the super thief Lupin was no different than a monster. Both detectives still thought that two of them were overkill. But first, let's address the case at hand. The super thief Lupin had sent a letter stating that between 11:00 and 11:30 p.m. on the 19th, he would steal a diamond called the Penultimate Night owned by him. The reason for its name was because the diamond is black. It is precious and has never been displayed. It is kept in a fortified cellar surrounded by a moat. To the south, there is a canal and an underground tunnel, large enough for a person to enter. Sherlock had that area sealed off, and the diamond is protected by over 100 guards and police, along with 2 detectives and 2 representatives from a 200-year-old insurance cooperative. According to Lupin's investigations, this cooperative has 7 strongest members who will do anything to protect their clients. They all wear white and are extremely skilled. The first person assigned to protect the Iron Man was Representative number 5, Reinhold. The second was Representative number 7, Fatima. Aya recognized that Reinhold would be the biggest obstacle for her. He also showed a clear dislike for Aya and Shinichi because they were not human. The Iron Man then led everyone down to the basement to access the room containing the diamond. This place required 3 keys and 4 people to open the door. The Penultimate Night was kept in an intricately designed safe. However, the diamond was just a synthetic product, so it wasn't really worth much. Aya noticed that the safe was made of silver, a metal despised by both vampires and werewolves. The diamond inside must carry a history. 20 years ago, a friend of the Iron Man unearthed the diamond from a 14th century relic. He placed the diamond in the safe and handed it over to the Iron Man, and it took 10 years to decode the intricate mechanism to retrieve the diamond. The diamond's surface bore inscriptions that Aya translated, specifically mentioning werewolves. After investigating the diamond's origins, the Iron Man learned that in southern Germany there once thrived a clan of dwarves, but they were annihilated by a clan of werewolves. Out of revenge, they passed on the location of their enemies' hideout to their descendants through the indestructible diamond and a silver safe that their enemies could not touch. Now, in the room, besides the locks mentioned earlier, there was a microphone for external communication. The ceiling had a spiral vent. The exterior was blocked with an iron grid to ensure that no person could pass through. That's enough discovery for today. Before leaving, Sherlock whispered something to the Iron Man. Shinichi asked Aya if she had figured out a way to deal with Lupin, and she had indeed come up with a plan. On the afternoon of January 19th, the Shinichi group went to sit by the river. Aya said she wanted to visit the Iron Statue Museum, so Shizuku went to ask for directions. Meanwhile, Watson's assistant and Sherlock's brother realized the person in front of them wasn't Sherlock, based on the fact that Sherlock's real fingernails weren't that long, and the real Sherlock was right behind them. The man removed his mask, and he was indeed the super thief Lupin. As the Shinichi group was following the map to the museum, Shinichi thought to greet Sherlock when he realized Aya had disappeared. He had mistakenly taken someone else's birdcage and received a punch from Shizuku. At that moment, Lupin declared that there was no lock he couldn't break and jumped into a car driven by the ghost, escaping. While talking, they almost ran into Shizuku. She asked if they had seen a birdcage. Because he's a hopeless simp, Lupin invited Shizuku to join him in the search. At this point, Shinichi happened to run into Annie and also joined to look. Upstairs, Sherlock's brother warned him to be wary of the insurance representatives, as he had a feeling they couldn't be trusted. However, the group most likely to influence their work was Shinichi and Aya's. Since the penultimate night diamond could lead to the werewolves, they might not only refrain from preventing the theft, but could even try to steal it themselves. On the street below, the man who had mistakenly taken Aya's birdcage realized his error, and was startled to see her. In his shock, he threw the cage into the road, causing Aya to be hit by a car. But a worse misfortune occurred when the vehicle that ran her over happened to be carrying the twin criminals from the day before. It's unclear how these two had escaped police custody, but they had intentions towards Aya since their first sighting of her. Just then, Shizuku arrived and saw Aya on the twins' vehicle, so she swerved to follow. Annie and Shinichi, who were searching nearby, noticed Shizuku and joined the chase. Shinichi leaped onto rooftops and dived down to the twins, successfully rescuing Aya and returning her to the cage. Lupin realized they were the cage messenger group, and Aya recognized Lupin because he was wearing an outfit identical to Sherlock's. Shinichi introduced himself as the Demon Slayer, but when translated, it meant he was stronger than Lupin, who then requested to learn from him. Lupin threw a marble and skated on it to attack. The two young men danced in the air for a while before landing back on the ground. Shinichi was hit by a marble in the forehead and ended up taking a hook to the jaw and collapsing. Lupin warned Aya's group to stay away from this case, but he didn't realize that all of it was part of Aya's plan. Big Ben then struck 8 o'clock. Everyone had to go through a security check before entering the Iron Man's mansion. A French inspector arrived and was beard tested by Sherlock to see if he was Lupin in disguise before being led inside. As they entered the room, Aya's group left a letter for Sherlock stating they would take responsibility for ground security. Sherlock didn't care, as monsters only understand monster thoughts. Reinhold refused to stay in the dusty room and also requested to guard on the ground. Sherlock knew this made it easier to trap Lupin, so he let it be. That left only 6 people in the room. 3 hours remained until the appointed time, but everyone decided to close early. All sat around the silver safe, waiting to see what Lupin would do. At 10 o'clock, there was an explosion under the moat. Upon hearing that a police officer's uniform had been stolen, Sherlock immediately shot and destroyed all the locks. Now, the room was completely sealed, with no way in or out. Even calling a locksmith would take 5 hours to break in. Sherlock came up with this idea because although Lupin boasted he could pick any lock, it wouldn't matter if the locks couldn't be opened at all. Those around him thought Sherlock was a genius upon hearing this. By 10:55 p.m., nothing had happened yet, so the Iron Man suggested Sherlock and Watson place their hands on the safe. At 11:10 p.m., the room began to shake. The earlier explosion had caused water from the moat to flood in through the vent. Sherlock realized he wasn't as smart as he thought, having been psychologically manipulated by Lupin into destroying the lock. Now, there was no way out. Hearing that the people in the basement were trapped, Reinhold sent Fatima down to rescue them, while he stayed above to watch for Lupin. Those below weren't too panicked, knowing the room wouldn't completely flood. They clung to the statues on the ceiling as the water rose. Fatima arrived just in time to break the door open and help them escape. However, when the water receded, the iron safe had actually disappeared. The exact time was 11:30 p.m. No one knew how Lupin had stolen the safe, as it seemed impossible to enter or leave the room freely. They then decided to warm up by the fireplace and think further. But once there, Sherlock borrowed a pair of handcuffs from the French inspector and promptly handcuffed him. Sherlock knew he was Lupin in disguise. This was because, as they walked over a bridge, the inspector's steps didn't make the usual creaking sound, indicating his beer belly was fake. Lupin confessed and explained that he had used a rope threaded through the flowing water and attached it to the safe for his accomplices to pull out. Lupin removed his mask, but remained confident he had won. However, the safe didn't contain the diamond, as Sherlock had switched its location. The real diamond was supposed to be in another jacket pocket, but when they checked, it wasn't there. Lupin had kept it in his hand and used a smoke bomb to escape. The mansion was then thrown into chaos as everyone searched for Lupin. But the one who used a stolen police uniform to escape was Lupin. He is described as a thief similar to a legendary figure in Japanese folklore, Ishikawa Goemon, who was executed by boiling, which enraged his followers into stealing every pot in the world. As a result, eateries faced major issues as they lacked pots for cooking and serving. Meanwhile, Lupin and the ghost met again. One had the diamond, the other the safe. But the real obstacle was Aya. According to Shinichi, the way people caught the pot thieves was by having someone guard inside them. Now, they planned to use a similar strategy to deal with Lupin. After finishing the story, Shinichi bowed, and Aya revealed that Lupin had mistaken Annie for her. So she deliberately incited Shinichi to lose to boost Lupin's ego. At dusk, she met the Iron Man and asked to hide in the safe. She had to keep the safe tightly closed all the while to wait for this moment. Lupin knew he had been exposed but was confident his ghost could handle Shinichi. However, the ghost fled, forcing Shizuku to give chase. Reinhold also arrived and demanded to deal with everyone at once. Suddenly, the bridge outside was destroyed, cutting off their escape route. But the one who destroyed the bridge wasn't Lupin, but a society led by the man with the M cane. He had led his group here to find Lupin. His society consisted of non-human creatures. He was only interested in the diamond. What happened to his old friends was up to them. They then began to spread out to slaughter. Meanwhile, Reinhold attacked Lupin but also targeted Shinichi. Shinichi dodged and used Lupin's escape to distract Reinhold. He followed Lupin, demanding the diamond back, forcing Reinhold to chase after the thrown diamond, while Shinichi pursued Lupin. Sherlock and Dr. Watson also arrived and learned of the situation from Aya. She asked Sherlock to take her along as her knowledge might be helpful. The ghost, having escaped Shizuku, then encountered Fatima. She was hunting the ghost as his name was on a hit list. She drew 2 crossbows and forced the ghost to reveal himself. However, evading her was futile as the arrows from her crossbows eventually caught up with him. Meanwhile, Sherlock and Aya had arrived at the library, where many had been massacred. Upon seeing the face of the perpetrator, Sherlock immediately recognized him as a Leicester, not just some fool from the Alliance. A Leicester had recently been in the news for creating various fanatical cults throughout London, known for their brutal ritual. Sherlock spotted a trick up his sleeve, flicking out a poison needle. Seeing that they had caught on to his trick, a Leicester knew he needed to eliminate them. Meanwhile, the inspector accidentally encountered a vampire woman. Unafraid of his feeble gun, Shizuku came to his aid. But she was still on a mission to find the ghost, so she asked if they had seen him. Neither knew, so she was about to leave when the vampire woman wouldn't allow it. Meanwhile, Reinhold, Lupin, and Shinichi were still engaged in a 3-way chase. All after the diamond, they chased into a church, accidentally dropping the diamond there. Lupin then suggested an alliance with Shinichi. Reinhold entered and was distracted by Shinichi, allowing Lupin the opportunity to push a piano onto him. Meanwhile, the ghost started using the shadows to outmaneuver Fatima. Being adept at controlling sound, Fatima couldn't pinpoint the ghost's location to shoot. Shizuku was getting overwhelmed by the immortal vampire. Although she had weapons made of silver, which could harm the vampire, hitting her was another issue. Unexpectedly, the vampire's blood was poisonous. The poison affected Shizuku, putting her under the vampire's spell. Meanwhile, after a gunfight with illusions, Sherlock found himself out of ammunition. Aya asked why they needed the diamond, and they simply wanted to find werewolves to bolster their ranks. While chatting, Sherlock had taken a cane to find a Leicester and knocked a needle into his face. A Leicester managed to grab an antidote just as the mastermind appeared. According to Sherlock, it was Dr. Moriarty. Back with Shinichi, Reinhold was still alive. Suddenly, the ghost and Fatima crashed in. Another member from the Professor's Society also arrived. He used magic to instantly steal the diamond and swiftly dealt with the 2 insurance representatives. Lupin and the ghost had already slipped away, knowing they couldn't retrieve the diamond from that monster. Aya was shocked by the name Moriarty, as it belonged to the leader of a criminal organization who was supposed to have died long ago. He had been keeping Aya's body for research, and after 8 years, he had returned to form an even larger criminal gang by gathering various monsters and recruiting an unimaginably talented apprentice. This apprentice had begged for a monster's body, so Moriarty taught him transplant surgery, and the person Moriarty was referring to was no stranger to them. He had committed heinous crimes 11 years ago, known as Jack the Ripper, and Jack was currently facing off against Shinichi. Shinichi engaged in a light exchange of moves and noticed that Jack had some similarities to him. Professor Moriarty revealed that he and Jack had traveled to Japan to find specimens of demons and immortals. By loathing demons and using cells from immortals, he could create an extremely powerful warrior with terrifying regenerative abilities. He experimented on many subjects, most of whom went mad from the demonic power, so he adjusted the balance before operating on Jack. Moriarty realized that Aya's immortal body was also a kind of hybrid demon, probably surgically modified by someone in the past. She admitted this and expressed her disdain for whoever had given her immortality. He had used her cells to make Jack immune to demonic cells. From there, he began taking Jack around to implant various other species into him. As a result, Jack now had vampire traits but was not afraid of silver and could walk in the sunlight. And now, Moriarty was targeting werewolf traits. In short, he had created a being with a human body and immortal abilities, the attacking power of a demon, and the regenerative ability of a vampire. However, this seemingly invincible creature still had one weakness: Shinichi. Although Shinichi was severely beaten by Jack, his strikes still inflicted significant injuries on Jack, hindering his healing abilities. Jack then remembered that Shinichi was the specimen that had escaped from Moriarty. Shinichi also recalled that Jack had always been around the old man. Shinichi revealed that he had followed them here to perform, leading Jack to decide to ignore Shinichi and not take his life. At this time, the vampire woman was trying to charm Shizuku. She quickly grabbed a nearby cross and stabbed the vampire, causing her great pain and prompting her to retaliate. However, Jack fired a flare to signal everyone to leave. Professor Jack's group had completed their tasks, so he also called Aleister and Franken to leave. Before leaving, he announced the name of the organization he was building. The night banquet. Shinichi then rejoined Sherlock and Aya's group. Shizuku was also safe. They were unaware of Lupin's group's whereabouts, but Sherlock knew that Lupin had used the sewer system to escape. Since the water in the moat had been drained, he could escape. However, regarding the silver safe, it seemed Lupin had managed to steal it, but Shinichi wanted them to watch his performance. At this point, Jack had returned to the organization and intended to show the diamond to the professor, but his jacket had been torn unknowingly. Shinichi had skillfully stolen the diamond from Jack. Aya then deciphered the poem. She asked Sherlock to shine a light through the diamond, and a phrase "forest of fangs" appeared inside it, seemingly the location of the werewolves. Shinichi remembered Jack had done something similar, so the night banquet might also know this information. Years ago, a mother and child werewolf were hunted by villagers. They were forced to hide in a tower, but the villagers burned it down to kill them. Back in the present, Aya's group set off for the Forest of Fangs in southern Germany. Aya warned them to be cautious as they might be ambushed by Moriarty's people. Aya had once encountered a werewolf. The werewolf could shift between 3 forms. In human form, they were almost indistinguishable from humans. In anthropomorphic form, they were slightly superior. But in full wolf form, their senses were significantly enhanced, and their skin was so tough it could withstand bullets. Suddenly, while searching, Aya's group encountered a bearded man. He recognized the 3 as detectives specializing in monster investigations and begged for their help because a girl from the village had been taken by a werewolf. Upon arriving in the village, they were avoided by the locals. Aya asked an old man to recount the story. Specifically, a year ago, the village leader's granddaughter was taken and found dead in the forest the next day. Her head and back were broken. Her face was mangled and distorted. One arm was gnawed off, and her body bore numerous bite marks. 4 months later, the miller's daughter was the next victim, and her condition was also extremely gruesome. Another 4 months passed, and the baker's daughter was the next victim. All 3 incidents occurred on rainy nights. The marks found on the bodies were consistent, and the identifying features matched. Another thing was that just yesterday, another young girl was taken. Her father broke down the door to find the villain escaping through the window with his daughter. But unusually, there was no rain yesterday. 8 years ago, the village had driven a werewolf out before these calamities started. When they went to the church, the girl's father was suspected of harboring suspicions against someone from outside the village. But with 3 outsiders, it was not feasible to conclude that way. The detective group arrived, and Aya discouraged them from viewing the bodies in their transformed state. But they looked anyway and were shocked. The missing girl's father called Aya a monster, but since only she could solve the case, he had to listen to her. Aya then asked to inspect the crime scene and noticed the disarray. The fireplace hadn't been used the previous night, suggesting the villain had entered through the chimney. From the size and footprints, it could be inferred that the creature was anthropomorphic. She then asked the bearded old man to bring her dental imprints from the previous bodies and asked him to request Shizuku to bring her a ball the size of her head. She then questioned the mother about what she did last night. According to her, their activities were normal. One window was securely bolted, while the other, which was broken, was fixed and couldn't be opened. From this, the direction of the villain's escape was evident. Shizuku then went up to the roof to look for any traces. When she found nothing, she asked Shizuku to throw something down. The dust billowed up, and the old man brought the dental imprints. Aya concluded that this case was not caused by a mad werewolf, but by a rational being. There was blood on the bed, but no trace of it along the escape route, indicating that the villain had brought a bag to stuff the girl into. Additionally, the warehouse lock was also damaged, and it was known that a year ago it had been broken into and firearms inside were stolen. Since this coincided with the timing of the first incident, it needed consideration. The group then went to the village leader's house, and he had information about the Forest of Fangs and the location of the werewolves. He also knew about the diamond, so Aya decided to make a deal with him. She would catch and deal with the werewolf in the village in exchange for information from him. According to the village leader, the three suspects in the village were a doctor, an engineer, and a painter, all outsiders. The way to detect a werewolf was to place fragrant flowers or bang pots near their ears to startle them due to their sensitive senses. However, none of the three showed any reaction. Werewolves can control their blood and reproduction. The evolution and control of traits had made modern werewolves immune to silver and holy water. Therefore, the only way now was to kill them in human form to effectively eliminate a werewolf. But if the Werewolf King emerged, conventional methods would no longer work. The Werewolf King is a legend about a werewolf eventually producing an individual considered the deity of the werewolf clan. He had once seen a werewolf immune to silver. Previously, a mother and child werewolf had come to the village and fooled everyone. Fortunately, that day, a girl named Louise, who had just been kidnapped, had discovered them and helped drive the werewolves out of the village. Since then, she had been regarded as the guardian deity of the village. Regrettably, she too had now been kidnapped by an unidentified culprit. To learn more, the envoy group visited the engineer's house. About 13 years ago, he had found a pregnant woman injured deep in the forest. He learned her name was Rose and assumed she was a servant of some family, possibly dismissed due to an affair with her employer. At that time, the village was quite forgiving, so he brought her to the village to take care of her. 6 months later, Rose gave birth to a daughter named Jet. Rose mostly stayed indoors and was known for being intelligent and generous. Life was peaceful until one day, due to their resemblance, Rose mistakenly identified Louise as her daughter and exposed her werewolf identity. The villagers then burned both mother and daughter at the stake. The engineer confirmed the identity of their remains. Trusting the doctor, the engineer now suspected the painter was the only remaining suspect. The detective group then visited the painter's house. She had come to the area 5 years ago in search of a waterfall, and captivated by the scenery, she had stayed ever since. The parents of the victims had asked her to paint portraits of their children. The painter thought the perpetrators seemed to be just a wild wolf, sometimes seen at dawn or dusk. She described it as a wolf with unusually shiny golden fur. She was the only one who had seen the wolf. Living on the edge of the village, she had become the prime suspect. Whether or not the painter was the culprit remained uncertain, but Aya suspected she was lying about her background of living in an artist family and graduating from an art school. Aya noticed her brush-holding technique did not match that of a trained artist. The painter explained that she had fabricated her background due to being orphaned and discriminated against, to avoid embarrassment from her humble origin. While the detective group continued their investigation at the site where the engineer had found Rose, the night banquet was observing them from a distance. That evening, Aya was at the house of Dr. Uncle, who had heard Louise scream when she was abducted. Aya suddenly asked about how Louise's parents treated her, noticing the wheelchair's wheels and handrails were dirty, but the push handles were very clean. Aya wondered if Louise had ever been out alone. Mostly not, but he remembered about a year and a half ago. Louise had disappeared until the villagers found her wheelchair stuck in the mud by the riverbank, preventing her from moving. Suddenly, 2 visitors arrived and immediately started fighting. They were numbers 3 and 4 from the insurance organization. They had come to search for the werewolf, but now they admitted even if they captured the diamond, they wouldn't know how to use it. Shinichi mentioned that only the village leader knew how to use it, and he had promised to tell Aya if she successfully solved the case. The 2 sides decided to cease hostilities, and number 3 wanted Aya to quickly solve the case. Afterwards, Aya continued to tend to Shinichi's injuries, noticing that Shizuku seemed jealous of him. Suddenly, he noticed the villagers were rushing to surround the painter's house. She screamed for everyone to get back and confessed that she was the culprit and had eaten all the victims before transforming into a wolf and rushing out. Number 3 shot a silver bullet, but it had no effect, allowing her to escape. The detective group chased after and fought with the painter. Shinichi handed Aya to Shizuku for safety and continued the fight. Numbers 3 and 4 also fired a few shots. Shizuku intervened to help, but the painter dodged Shizuku and threw Aya down into the stream. Shizuku quickly jumped to push Aya back up and let herself fall into the waterfall. Although the culprit escaped, the village leader agreed to share how to use the diamond. At the edge of the village, standing where the tower had been burned down, they waited for the sunlight to shine through the first letter of the poem engraved on the diamond, revealing the location of the werewolf village in the Forest of Fangs. The night banquet, seeing the movement, also prepared. Shizuku had by then regained consciousness. She drifted downstream and was rescued by a werewolf named Nora, who, with the help of 2 close friends, helped her recover from her critical condition. Shizuku realized that this werewolf napped at midnight, having a schedule opposite to humans. The werewolves did not allow humans in, so Shizuku knew she had to leave as soon as possible. Meanwhile, Shizuku also learned that a series of murders targeting young girls on rainy days was occurring in the werewolf village. Since her gun did not match the type found on the bodies, they believed she was not the culprit. She wanted them to wait for Aya because Aya might solve the case. However, the more people entered the village, the more complicated it would become, so Nora thought it would be better for Shizuku to leave. Later, she made tea for the 3 wolf women, who all complimented its taste, and Shizuku wanted to learn more about the case. It started a year ago with a death every 4 months, totaling 3 victims so far. Each victim was shot in the chest, and the men in the village always lost the killer's trail because the rain erased all traces. No gunshot was ever heard. Until now, it was known that the killer used a handgun, was very skilled at ambushing, and knew how to perfectly erase their tracks. Since Shizuku couldn't investigate further, they decided to move her out of the village and find a water source to help mask her scent. Nora would distract the men elsewhere so her 2 friends could help Shizuku leave. On the way, Shizuku learned that no girl in the village could escape because the men would bring her back. The village girls were always taken by the village elder to become witches to improve the breed. Suddenly, the men were still there, so the 2 girls had to pretend in front of them. They just got past them when a small mistake exposed Shizuku's identity among the werewolves. She was chased and eventually surrounded by a large group. She spoke up to defend the 2 girls so they wouldn't be pursued. The village elder arrived, wanting to execute Shizuku immediately, but the 2 girls argued that Nora had saved Shizuku and wanted to hear what she had to say. They then took her to the wooden hill for questioning. The village elder was to judge whether she was lying. It had been a long time since the wooden hill was built, since the incident involving Rose. No matter her explanations, the village elder saw her as lying. The 2 girls also spoke in Shizuku's defense. Suddenly, during the trial, a gunshot was heard. The tribe rushed into the forest to find Nora had been shot dead. It was not raining today, yet no trace of the killer could be smelled. The village elder turned to blame Shizuku, but the men argued that Shizuku had been held at the wooden hill the whole time and couldn't have committed the crime. Unsure of what to do next, the werewolves let Shizuku examine the crime scene. There was very little blood around, leading Shizuku to guess that this wasn't where the killer had struck. Nora's body was wet but her clothes were dry, indicating she had submerged herself somewhere before dressing, and then being shot and moved here. There were bullet marks on a nearby tree, suggesting 2 shots were fired, but only one made a sound. Seeing that Shizuku couldn't offer further help, the werewolves decided to execute her, as they would not allow anyone else into the village. Meanwhile, Aya's group was ambushed by Franken, who pulled both Shinichi and Aya into a ravine, cutting off the insurance group. Franken then told them he had helped them escape the insurance group in exchange for the location of the werewolf village. Doubting Shinichi, Franken demanded the diamond as a token of trust, promising to return it if they met in the werewolf village. Afterward, they went their separate ways. Shinichi and Aya arrived at the werewolf village, which was holding a funeral for Nora. With the help of a female werewolf, Shinichi and Aya found Shizuku in a prison. Aya inquired about Shizuku's findings and commended her work. The men got wind of their presence and decided to check the prison. To avoid chaos, Shizuku decided to stay in the cell while Shinichi took Aya to investigate the crime scene. The werewolves quickly followed their scent, but Aya instructed Shinichi to maneuver around a sharp rock for observation. She helped Shinichi find a switch, and they both entered a tunnel just in time before the werewolves arrived. This was how the murderer covered their tracks after each crime. Bloodstains were still present below. The murderer's gun was also found here, indicating the victims were killed here before their bodies were moved to the surface. Aya recognized it as the gun Louise's father had lost from the warehouse. Continuing on, they discovered blood traces of Nora and a pond with an area that looked like someone had stayed there. The wall had a schedule carved into it, hinting at more information further ahead. Meanwhile, a villager accidentally discovered Louise's body. The detective group also found the painter's body. Next to it was a tunnel leading to the human village. Now, Aya understood that Rose had used this tunnel years ago to reach the human village. They met again with Dr. Uncle and heard about the discovery of Louise's body. Meeting Louise's parents again, Aya asked how they had treated Louise before she became the village's guardian deity. Back then, Louise was seen as a burden because she couldn't walk. 8 years ago, her parents had planned to abandon her. They left her in the forest, but unexpectedly, Jet, Rose's daughter, brought Louise back to the village that very night. Louise then revealed the identity of the mother and daughter werewolves on the same night. Essentially, Louise was abandoned. Jet saved Louise, who then betrayed Jet to appear useful to the village to avoid being abandoned herself. Louise was very clever because exposing them prevented the villagers from investigating and discovering that her parents had tried to abandon her. Aya now began to understand the situation better and decided to return to being a werewolf once again. They used the tunnel to return, checking a few things along the way. Numbers 3 and 4 also discovered the tunnel and decided to call the entire village. The vampire entered the village and started causing havoc. Shinichi's group quickly got Shizuku out of the prison. Aya wanted to return to the village because she had more to clarify. She asked the werewolf woman again if it was true that the villagers here lived nocturnally and separately. Once confirmed, she sent Shinichi to distract the werewolves. Hearing that Shizuku had escaped, the men started to mobilize. Franken and Aleister also reacted to the howling. Shinichi encountered 3 werewolves chasing him. He dodged the first, grabbed its tail, and smashed its head. He tricked the second into jumping onto a tree and strangled it. He lured the third to a cliff and jumped down, then rebounded off a tree to smash the third one's face. Aya then went to the werewolf cemetery to ascertain the final clue. Suddenly, the werewolf village was set on fire. Numbers 3 and 4 led the villagers to take revenge on the werewolves. 3 members of the night banquet began slaughtering the werewolves. Aya instructed the werewolf woman to dig up Nora's body for examination. She sent Shizuku back to help the werewolf village. When she went to find the remaining werewolf woman, she encountered the vampire again. Number 4 faced off against Franken and started a verbal fight. Number 3 met the magician. After a while, Aya understood the whole situation and decided to return to the village to resolve everything. While the other 2 factions were fighting, Number 4 managed to chain Franken. However, Shinichi arrived to assist Franken. Number 4 was quite skilled with the chain, making it difficult for Shinichi to counter. Seeing Shinichi struggling, Franken tore off his own arm and threw it to Shinichi, who used it to knock out the attacker. Shinichi then demanded the diamond back from Franken and interrogated him about Aya's body. It was revealed that it was still preserved in the night banquet's den in London. Number 3 and Leicester continued their long-range duel in another area. Number 3 threw a shovel up and shot a root to hit the shovel, striking Leicester. Meanwhile, the vampire discovered Shizuku wasn't wearing underwear, but she didn't want to discuss it. The vampire informed Shizuku that due to previous contact with her poison, Shizuku had developed antibodies. Doubtful of the truth, the vampire gave her a cut on the leg. Shizuku fell under the vampire's charm again, but the vampire assured her that what she said was true and it was only an illusion. She then left, sparing Shizuku this time. Elsewhere, Number 3 thought she had defeated Leicester, but he had switched bodies and left her a needle. Shinichi and Aya then reunited with Shizuku. Shinichi wanted to go solve the case, but Aya had other tasks for him. Outside, the villagers from both villages were preparing for a major combat. Finally, Aya arrived and called everyone to stop. She declared that she had found the culprit for both cases. The perpetrator was standing right on the wooden hill. It was none other than Jet, who was both Louise and Nora, Rose's daughter. Jet returned to the scene in the room where Louise was captured. Evidence showed that no one entered the room, but there were wolf footprints jumping from the window. The footprints by the fireplace should have been surrounded by dust if someone had entered through the chimney. But the area was clean, suggesting a self-staged act. When Aya realized the resemblance between Jet and Louise, she suspected that Jet was still alive. That night, the painter transformed into a real wolf, actually Jet in disguise, matching the bite marks found on Shinichi with those at the human village crimes. It seemed the painter was killed right after she and Shinichi left from their investigation. As for Nora's body found last night, it had actually been killed below in the den. If humans had passed through the tunnel, they would have needed a light, and the light would attract moths down there. Only a werewolf could navigate in the dark without disturbing the moth dust. Therefore, Nora's body was also staged by Jet. The person who lived in the den and was shot by Jet had a relatively short stature, and had been living there for a year and a half, coinciding with the time Louise disappeared. So, Aya was certain that the person killed last night was Louise, not Nora, as they looked very similar. Historically, Jet was helped by Rose to escape and live as a werewolf under the name Nora, while simultaneously playing the role of Louise in the human village. There are 5 reasons for her assertion. First, the two villages hardly interact with each other. Second, the tunnel allowed Jet to travel between the two villages in just over an hour. Third, the daily routines in the two villages are opposite. Fourth, Louise rarely interacted with her village and Nora lived alone, so no one would recognize them. Fifth, the water pond in the tunnel helped Jet eliminate sense when switching between her two identities. When they returned to the human village, Louise's body was discovered. Jet had exhumed Louise's body, mutilated it to obscure the gunshot wounds. In other words, Jet, still alive, was the perpetrator of the crimes in both the werewolf and human villages. Aya saw that Jet was overly obsessed with revenge. 13 years ago, Rose had escaped from this werewolf village to the human village. Months later, Jet was born. After living there for a while, the two were discovered by Louise, who exposed their identities, leading to their being burned alive. However, Jet survived and fled to the werewolf village. The small skeleton found was that of a fox in the tower. Jet came here and changed her name to Nora, but still hated this village, so she planned to incite conflict between the two villages. 1.5 years ago, Jet kidnapped Louise, but Louise also hated her village and decided to help Jet with her revenge. Thus, Jet lived with dual identities and gathered information. Over the past year, she committed continuous murders to fuel the animosity between the villages and staged the scenes to erase traces. But when the detective group arrived, her plans encountered problems. Jet chose the painter to take the blame and made her escape. Jet then rescued Shizuku and intentionally planned for Shizuku to be exposed. While the village was interrogating her, Jet went to the tunnel, killed Louise, and brought her body up to stage the scene. Her shooting the tree was to ensure Shizuku wasn't suspected as the perpetrator. When everyone thought she was dead, Jet went to dig up Louise's body to bring it back to the human village, then opened a hidden path to instigate conflict between the two villages. However, Jet realized Aya was still mistaken. She then left and encountered Shinichi in the tunnel. He had been waiting there to capture her, but she revealed that she herself was the werewolf queen and extinguished the candles to ambush him. Yet, he managed to knock her into the lake and tie her up while she was shedding her fur. Aya arrived and informed him that the conflict between the two villages had been resolved. Aya wanted Shinichi to release Jet because she had reasoned incorrectly. Jet hadn't planned the murders for revenge, but to liberate the priestesses from the fate imposed by the village elders. Being a werewolf queen and a priestess, it was hard to imagine what her future would hold. Thus, she wanted to free others like her from that grim fate, and by continually reusing bodies from the human side to deceive the werewolf side. She had saved 3 people by sacrificing 3 others. Because of the incorrect conclusion, Aya decided to let her go, and if there was a chance, they might meet again. Aya realized this was the first time she had been wrong and let a criminal go. She knew both villages had learned their lesson, but she was sure nothing would change. The film ends here, and only a sequel will reveal what happens next. Goodbye for now.